My new boss, Anna, was unlike anyone I had ever worked with. Sharp and always one step ahead, she was the kind of person who could influence an entire room without saying a word. When she first greeted me, her smile was both warm and reserved, as if she was already sizing me up in a way I didn't yet understand. I will never forget our first real interaction. It was after an exhausting meeting where I had barely been able to follow the discussions. I was trying to sneak back to my desk when I felt his gaze on me. "Can you come to my office for a moment?" she asked, her tone polite but not hesitant. My heart skipped a beat as I followed her down the hall, already wondering what I had done wrong. But instead of reprimanding her, she simply gestured to the chair in front of her desk, settling in with a sigh as if she had finally let her guard down for the first time that day. "The first few weeks can be tough," she said with a slight smile, her voice softer than I'd heard it before. "It's a lot to take in, isn't it?" I nodded, grateful for her understanding. We talked for a while and she told me about her first job, the mistakes she'd made, how she'd learned to pick herself up and keep going. "There's something interesting about you," she said thoughtfully, almost to herself, and I felt a strange surge of pride. It was the first sign that she saw me as more than just an employee. Little did I know that this moment would be the beginning of something I never would have anticipated. From that day on, everything changed. Anna began involving me in more projects, asking for my input in meetings and calling me into her office after hours for quick chats that lasted longer than I expected. Each interaction felt like she was slowly and cautiously inviting me into her world, like she was testing the bones. Then there were the late nights. She was often one of the last to leave the office, a trait we shared. More often than not, I found myself in her office long after everyone else had left, discussing strategy, exchanging ideas, or just working in silence side by side. She had a way of making me feel important, like my thoughts mattered, like I was her equal despite the gap in experience between us. One evening, after a hectic day of endless meetings, she surprised me by the coffee machine. "You look like you could use something stronger than that," she laughed, her eyes sparkling with that rare humor she reserved for moments outside the formalities of work. "Long day," I replied with a smile. "I'm not sure coffee will cut it." "Well," she said, glancing around the empty office, "how about a change of scenery? There's a nice little place around the corner." I was caught off guard. I wasn't used to my bosses inviting me out so casually after work, especially not bosses like her. The small bar she took me to was quiet, dimly lit, with a laid-back charm that seemed light years away from the hustle and bustle of the office. She ordered a drink, settling back with a contented sigh. "Sometimes I wonder if this job is really worth it," she said, almost to herself, swirling her glass. I was stunned to see someone so composed and controlled admit to doubts. It seemed unreal. She looked at me, a trace of vulnerability in her eyes. "It's funny," she said, "how the people you meet along the way can make everything different." Her eyes met mine for a moment longer than usual, and I felt a strange flutter, as if we had crossed an invisible line. From that night on, it was as if a silent understanding had settled between us. We didn't talk about it, but there was a new energy between us that I couldn't explain. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me from across the room during meetings, her gaze lingering just a little too long, her expression unreadable. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was imagining things after all. She was my boss and I couldn't risk thinking otherwise. But one Friday night, everything changed. It was late and most people had left early. I was working on a last-minute report when Anna approached my desk, looking more exhausted than ever. "How about we do a final checkup before the weekend?" she asked, a tired smile on her face. I followed her into her office, expecting a routine review of the week, but as soon as we were alone, I felt the atmosphere change. She closed the door, her hand lingering on the handle for a moment before she turned to me, leaning against her desk with her arms crossed. "You've really impressed me these past few months," she began. "They're gentler than usual. It's rare to find someone who can keep up here." I managed to smile, trying to keep my composure, but my heart was pounding. I wasn't sure if it was her words or the way she was looking at me, but something about this moment felt charged, like we were on the brink of something neither of us dared to name. She continued speaking, her voice softer, and I realized she wasn't just complimenting me, she was confiding in me. She told me about the weight of responsibility, the personal sacrifices she had made, and the nights spent alone in her office, wondering if it was all worth it. She looked up, her gaze fixed on mine, and for the first time, I felt like I was seeing Anna not as my boss, but as a person, someone who, in that moment, felt as vulnerable and uncertain as I did. Our conversation drifted, and as the minutes passed, I lost track of time. Anna's laughter filled the room, her guard completely down as she shared anecdotes about her past, her travels, her dreams beyond the office walls. Her laughter was contagious, and soon I found myself laughing with her, forgetting for a moment that there was anything separating us. But soon, the laughter faded and we found ourselves in a silence charged with something I could not name. She looked at me, her expression unreadable, and I felt a rush of emotion that I couldn't control. There was something in her eyes that made me feel like I was the only person in the world who truly understood her. She broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what I would do without those moments. His words were simple, but the weight they carried was undeniable. I wanted to respond, to say something that would sum up everything I felt, but words failed me. Instead, I just nodded, hoping she would understand. For a moment, we were just two people, two souls trying to understand each other in a world that seemed too big, too fast. But as quickly as that moment had come, it was gone. She straightened, clearing her throat as if to chase away the vulnerability she had just shown. "Well," she said, her voice returning to its usual calm. "I guess we should both call it a night." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of disappointment and relief as I stood to leave. As I reached the door, I felt her hand on my arm. I turned around and there she was, closer than ever. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I felt like I could see right into her soul. "Thank you," she said softly, "for listening, for being there." Her words hung in the air as I left her office, my mind reeling from the intensity of what had just happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line, that we had entered a territory where things would never be the same again. Over the next few weeks, everything seemed to move in a direction I didn't know how to handle. Anna and I continued to work together on various projects, and whenever we were in her office, there was an invisible thread connecting us, a bond we both seemed to recognize but were too careful to name. The air had changed. Small gestures, furtive glances, heavy silences, almost like conversations in themselves. One evening, as I was finishing a report, Anna's voice rose from her desk. "Can you come for a moment?" Her tone was calm, neutral, but it carried something I couldn't identify. I took a deep breath, pushing my nerves aside, and walked into her office, trying to remain relaxed, though my heart was pounding. When she saw me, she didn't immediately look up, absorbed in a document on her desk. Eventually, she put her pen down and looked up at me. "Close the door, please." Her request was simple, but it seemed loaded with meaning. I closed the door, suddenly realizing that the office was completely empty, just the two of us, alone, with no distractions, no noise except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. "Sit down," she said, motioning to the chair in front of her desk. As I settled in, I noticed a tension in her face I'd never seen before. She was studying me as if weighing her words. "I've been thinking a lot about connections lately," she began, her voice almost hesitant, a rare vulnerability coming through, "and how people cross paths for reasons we don't always understand. Like you here, I can't help but think that maybe she stopped, catching herself, and for the first time I saw her waver, her usual serenity crumbling." "Anna?" I said softly, leaning a little toward her, feeling a pull toward something deeper, something unspoken. "Is everything okay?" She parted her lips slightly as if she wanted to say something important, something that would dispel the fog that surrounded us. But she shook her head, a slight smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Are you okay?" she answered, though her eyes betrayed some truth. "Just too many sleepless nights, I guess?" For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if we were waiting, both aware that this was no ordinary conversation. Then, as suddenly as the moment had appeared, she became distant again, her professional mask reinstalling itself. "Let's get back to work," she said, her tone quicker, almost hasty, as if she were trying to erase what had just happened. I nodded, a strange mix of frustration and desire washing over me as I made my way back to my desk. But deep down, I knew things weren't as simple as she was trying to make them seem. In the days that followed, I tried to keep my distance, to maintain some normalcy, but no matter how hard I tried, the memory of that night lingered, fueling a tension that seemed to only grow. Sometimes I would look up from my desk and meet his gaze, both of us looking away quickly, as if we had just been caught red-handed doing something wrong. Then one night it happened. I was about to leave when she called me into her office. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "But can you stay a little longer tonight? There's something I'd like to review with you." It was a simple request, but the weight behind it seemed impossible to ignore. In her office, she stood by the window staring out at the city lights. She seemed lost in thought, and when she finally turned to face me, there was a softness in her gaze, a warmth that comforted and worried me at the same time. I closed the door behind me, feeling the tension tighten. She motioned for me to come closer, pointing to a file on her desk. "I'd like your opinion on this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But as I got closer, our hands brushed, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting for a reaction. I couldn't help it. I looked up and met his gaze. And in that moment, the air seemed charged, heavy with everything we had both held back. Neither of us spoke, but it seemed as if we were silently acknowledging what was building between us. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered almost to herself, her voice so low I could barely hear her. Her hand stayed close to mine, as if waiting for me to make the next move. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to back away, to get away before this went too far. But something else kept me there, rooted to the spot, unable to leave without doing something. I reached out my hand to his, barely brushing his fingers. It was a small gesture, almost innocent, but it felt monumental. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers closed around mine, a silent admission of everything we were both too afraid to say out loud. "I shouldn't do this," she whispered, but even as she said it, her fingers tightened around me as if she feared I would disappear. "But I don't want it to stop," I replied, my voice firm, my resolve unwavering. "We held back our desires too long." She nodded, her hesitation melting away, and in that moment, all the barriers we had erected dissipated. We lost ourselves in each other, our shared restraint giving way to an intensity neither of us could control. She pulled me closer, her lips searching for mine again, this time more urgent, more fervent. I could feel the depth of everything she had held back, the feeling she had tried to bury, and it only made my desire grow stronger. We moved together, letting the moment swallow us up. Each kiss grew deeper, each caress bolder. Her hands traced a path down my back, and I leaned into her, matching her pace, letting her guide me. It was like we were surrendering to something inevitable, something that had been brewing between us since the very beginning. At one point she pulled away, panting, her gaze intense. "I've wanted this for so long," she confessed, her voice barely louder than a breath. "Me too," I replied, my voice just as shaky. She cut me off with another kiss, her hands curling into my hair, pulling me even closer. I could feel the unspoken promises in every gesture, every lingering caress. This wasn't just attraction. It was a connection that went beyond logic, beyond the roles we played. We were equals in that moment, two people finally shedding their defenses. The hours passed in a blur, but each second felt like an eternity. Every caress, every look was etched in my memory. We were lost in the haze of our connection, our bodies swaying together as if drawn by an invisible force. Time seemed to stop, and our surroundings faded into insignificance. Nothing existed except the warmth of his gaze, his eyes that seemed to see deep inside me, and the silent understanding that passed between us. Every smile, every burst of laughter resonated deeply. Our hearts beat in perfect synchrony, and every moment remained etched in my memory. The next few days felt surreal, like I was living in two worlds at once. At the office, Anna and I exchanged professional nods, careful to keep our interactions strictly professional, as if nothing had ever happened. But beneath the surface, I could still feel the echoes of that night, the moments that had left their mark, that had changed something in both of us. Every glance we exchanged carried a silent memory, a reminder of what lay beneath our controlled exterior. The tension, however, only grew. It was a strange feeling and a challenge to navigate the boundaries we had created after we connected. I was constantly aware of her presence, of every time she passed my desk, of the way her eyes sometimes lingered a little longer than necessary. Then one evening it all came to a head. It was a Friday, the end of a hectic week, and as the office emptied, Anna stopped by my desk. "Can you meet me in the conference room?" she asked, her voice calm and professional, but there was something in her eyes that made my heart race. "Sure," I replied, keeping my tone neutral, but my mind was already racing. I gathered my things and followed her, my thoughts a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She walked ahead of me, and when we reached the conference room, she closed the door behind us and turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm but soft, and I knew this conversation would be unlike any we'd had so far. I sat down, watching her as she paced for a moment before settling in across from me. "What happened between us?" "What do you mean?" Her eyes meeting mine. "It was real, and I don't regret a thing." Those words hung in the air, each one ringing with an honesty that caught me off guard. "But we can't keep pretending that it hasn't affected things, that it's not going to change the way we work together," she added. I nodded, understanding the weight of what she was saying. "I know," I replied, my voice barely audible. "I felt it too." She sighed, her hands clasped in front of her as if to ground herself. "I've had enough experience in this business to know what happens when the lines between personal and professional get blurred," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "But I care too much about my career and about you to let this get out of hand." Hearing her admit that she cared for me brought a warmth to my chest, but it was tinged with the reality of what we both knew was coming. "So what do we do?" I asked, trying to keep my emotions in check. Anna paused, her eyes softening as she leaned forward. "Maybe," she said slowly, "we give each other space, we let things settle, we focus on our work, but we don't deny what happened. We won't pretend it's not important." Her words were thoughtful, measured. She sought a balance, a way to preserve what we had shared without letting it swallow us up. I nodded, a mixture of relief and sadness in my chest. "I think I can do this," I said, though part of me knew it would be harder than I wanted to admit. We stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of the decision, knowing that we were choosing the cautious path, the one that would protect what we had worked so hard for. But as much as it pained me to withdraw, I respected his honesty, his willingness to confront the reality of our situation even more. When we finally left the conference room, the office was deserted. The quiet hum of the building was a stark contrast to the inner storm I felt. I walked her to the elevator, our footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, and as we waited, neither of us spoke, each lost in thought. When the elevator arrived, she turned to me, her eyes soft but resolute. "Take care," she said, a slight smile playing on her lips. "Remember, this isn't goodbye, it's just a way for us to find a way forward." "I understand," I replied, feeling a strange sense of closure mixed with unfulfilled longing. "Thank you for everything." The doors closed, and as I watched her disappear, a quiet acceptance settled over me. I knew we'd made the right decision, that we'd chosen a path that respected our respective lives, our futures. But that didn't make the feelings any easier to ignore. In the weeks that followed, Anna and I maintained a respectful distance, focusing on our work and gradually getting back into the rhythm of our professional roles. The initial attention slowly dissipated, replaced by a mutual understanding, a silent respect for the connection we had shared. And while there were times when I found myself remembering his touch, his warmth, I knew that what we had experienced would always be a part of me, a memory I would carry forward. One afternoon, as I was finishing a report, she stopped by my desk. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a glimmer of the person she had shown me during those quiet moments together. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice steady, "for understanding, for being exactly what I thought you were." The words surprised me, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a silent validation that reminded me why I had been drawn to her in the first place. "Thank you," I replied, a slight smile crossing my lips, "for everything." She nodded slightly, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if nothing had changed, as if we were back in this office, sharing a connection that transcended the walls around us. Then, with a quiet smile, she turned and walked away, leaving me with a sense of peace, a sense that despite the boundaries we had established, we had found something meaningful, something worth cherishing. Months passed and life went on. Our interactions returned to a friendly professionalism, the kind of relationship that had always existed between us before everything changed. We were colleagues again, with a shared understanding that didn't need to be expressed out loud, a silent agreement about the depth that lay beneath the surface. And though the intensity of our connection had faded, I knew the impact of those moments would stay with me. He had shaped me, taught me to appreciate authenticity, to see the quiet power of respect and mutual understanding. In the years that followed, I watched Anna continue to excel, her career reaching new heights as she took on demanding roles that showcased all of her talent and resilience. She remained a guiding presence in my life, someone I respected not only as a mentor but as a friend, someone who had shown me the power of vulnerability, the courage to face difficult decisions with grace. And every now and then, in the rare moments we were alone, we would exchange a furtive glance, a fleeting reminder of a connection that had changed us both. It was enough, a reminder that we had shared something rare and profound, something that had enriched our lives in ways we could never fully express. Time has a way of putting things into perspective, of revealing the importance of moments we may have once overlooked. Looking back, I am grateful for the journey we shared, for the lessons we learned, for the quiet strength of a bond that transcended expectations. And as I moved forward, building new connections, pursuing new goals, I carried Anna's memory with me, a memory that reminded me of the beauty of authenticity, the power of human connection, the quiet resilience that lives within us all. Our story didn't end with grand gestures or dramatic goodbyes. She became a part of who I am, a silent presence that shaped me, taught me to appreciate the moments that really matter, the people who leave an indelible mark on our lives. In the end, I knew our connection was unique, something that would always be a part of my story. Leave a like and above all don't forget to subscribe for the next story.